Well, if you can open your Bibles to Genesis chapter 37, that's on page 41 in the church Bibles, page 41. And I've just remembered something very important, so hang on a minute, there we go. Okay, I think I'm going to have some competition this morning, but we'll see how we go. So, Genesis chapter 37. Firstly, some questions. Are the circumstances in your life perplexing? Are God's purposes now or at times in the past mysterious? Do you feel the need of help? Do you wish there was someone who could just come and sort everything out? Well, for those of you that were here last week or listened to last week's sermon, perhaps I thought it might be helpful. It was a very dramatic passage there in Genesis 35, and like a ship that's maybe been in a storm and there's been lots going on, sometimes it's good to just drop anchor for a few moments. And I thought that might be helpful because as we come to Genesis 37, we are entering into a new section of Genesis. The narrator, Moses, is taking us into a new section. And don't worry, I'm not going to recap on Genesis right from Genesis 1, but there are a couple of building blocks, and I think it's just good to remind ourselves very, very quickly. God created the world. It was very good. It was perfect. There was Adam and Eve, different from the animals, made in the image of God, a perfect relationship with each other and a perfect relationship with God. That lovely picture of God walking in the midst of the garden, it was just perfect. They had everything they needed and they just had one command, as it were, one thing to obey, not to eat of the fruit of that particular tree. But of course we know, don't we, that it went terribly, terribly wrong. Sin came into the world and Adam and Eve experienced a broken world, a broken relationship between themselves, and very significantly a broken relationship between them and their maker, God. And yet, as after that very sad event, as sin comes into the world, the fall as it's known, as God speaks to each of the parties, really, he speaks to the serpent, and we get this glimmer of hope that this descendant to come, this seed, is going to crush the head of the serpent, the enemy. Then, of course, we have the first family, and we see, don't we, that there's hatred in that family and there's jealousy in that family, and that family is ripped apart as one brother kills another. Then we have things getting worse and worse and worse, so much so that God sends the flood. You think maybe the lessons have been learned, it's a time to reboot, an opportunity to restart. But no, the problems are not solved. And then we get to Genesis chapter 12, where God comes and gives these great promises that from a seed, from a descendant, his family will be great, but also all the people from all nations of the world will be blessed. And then God, as it were, reaffirms those promises in Genesis 15. He makes this covenant, this binding promise that just cannot and will not be broken. And then we have in chapter 36, which you're probably glad we skipped, a whole list of Esau's descendants. They become known as the Edomites. And now we're back with Jacob's family in chapter 37. But just one thing to notice, and if I was to say, how does God work primarily in this world? You might say, well, if he's got this great plan, he gave us this glimmer of hope in Genesis 3, why doesn't he just work through angels? Well, he does. Why doesn't he just work with miraculous wonders? Well, he does. But primarily, he works through families. The good, the bad, and the ugly, if you remember that film. And I think we've got a slide. Here we go. Maybe you've seen something like that. Maybe you feel like maybe you should have something like that at home. Sometimes it's a doormat, sometimes it's up on the door. I remember I was actually delivering tracts as it happens, and one house had strangers welcome family by appointment. So they were sort of taking it even a little bit further. And of course, in chapter 35, it was quite a mess, wasn't it? And we may think, well, we now come to Jacob's family. Surely it can't be any worse. Surely things are going to get better. Well, I'll leave you to decide by the end whether you think that's happened or not. But I think we have a problem. And the problem is this, that well, let me put it like this. Do you want to benefit from chapter 37 and from the rest of the time that we spend in Genesis? Oh, thank you, Peter. Someone was like, yes! Good. How can we avoid this problem? The problem is this, that most of us, if not all of us, know the end of the story, don't we? Maybe sometimes you're sitting in your lounge and you're with your partner, your husband, your wife, or someone else, and perhaps they're watching something on TV and it's not something that particularly you want to watch and you're not interested in it, but you're all together, and so you put your earphones in and basically you pick up a book or you just relax listening to your music, and you're trying to block out what's going on. And what we need to try and do this morning is the same. And as we go through the rest of Genesis, because Joseph didn't know what was going to happen next, and neither did Jacob, and neither did his brothers. Familiarity with the Word of God is a real problem, and I think particularly with a story like Joseph. So maybe it helps if we can try and block all of that out and think about these characters as we go through. How would they be feeling? What would they expect to happen next? What thoughts and emotions would they have? What were they thinking, or what might they be thinking about God? And this morning we're going to look at this passage through 3 windows. I think we've got a slide here. I don't know whether can anyone tell me, does that mean anything to anyone? Yes? Play school, thank you. 60s, 70s and 80s apparently. And of course the saying was, today we're going to go through the round window, because they were going to think about cars maybe. Okay, well we've got 3 windows to look through today. And as we go through the first window, you'll see I'm missing out certain points, but don't worry, I'm not ignoring them, we're going to come back to them. So the first window is to primarily look through the lens, as it were, of Joseph's brothers. But we do touch on Jacob and Joseph himself. So, verse 2. This is the account of Jacob's family. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah, the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. And I'd either forgotten or maybe I never knew, but apparently the Hebrew word here, the original word here, has got very much the idea of an evil report. In other words, what Joseph said about his brothers had some element of truth, but perhaps was exaggerated, or perhaps he chose to miss certain points out. In other words, he was making it as bad as possible. And this report that he brings back to his father really sets off a chain reaction that follows through in the rest of, well, this chapter, and indeed right through the rest of Genesis. And it is a reminder, isn't it, that just a few words said to someone, an email sent, unwise, tired, should have waited, just a few words. You can't pull those words back, can you? And yet it can have such an impact. And then we have these striking words, don't we? Israel, another name for Jacob, verse 3, loved Joseph more than any of his other sons. In this family, favoritism was deeply entrenched. It goes back generations. And it wasn't something that Jacob just kept to himself. It was on display. You couldn't make more of a statement than to give your son this special robe. The only other time that this Hebrew word is used in the Bible is in 2 Samuel, and it's used to describe a princess, a costume or a tunic worn by a princess. It has this idea of royalty, of position, of importance. Apparently it was very long and very long-sleeved. This was not something for someone who was going to be doing manual labour. But I guess as we think about favoritism, it's rather hard for us to relate to this tunic. I mean, you wouldn't expect to be given this kind of a tunic, would you? Well, I remember, I don't know when it was, but we got another picture here of someone you'll all know. Here he is. And he was telling apparently a true story where his parents were at some kind of social event, and they were talking about their family, and one of them said, oh, your son, he's an actor. And they went, oh, yeah. But do you know about our other son? He's a director in a merchant bank in London. And Hugh Grant was just telling the story because it was kind of like, oh, well, he's an actor. I mean, that's not really a proper job. But our other son, now he's really done well for himself. And maybe sometimes we have the equivalent today. I don't know whether you've ever been at a meal with someone and maybe they say, oh, have you heard about our son Henry? You know, he's gone to Oxford. And yeah, Oxford and Cambridge were fighting over him, and he's studying nuclear physics, of course, and no mention of the other son. Or you've got the grandparents and they're talking about one of their grandchildren, and oh, by the way, it's a coincidence if anyone's got a grandchild called Freya, just make up the names. Freya's so lovely, and she comes and she sits on Grandpa's lap, and she loves to hear stories, and she always gives Grandma this extra cuddle before she leaves at the end of the day. It's not the main lesson of the passage, but, you know, it is easy to show favoritism. And that's not consistent with God's character. James tells us that it's breaking the commandment to love our neighbours as ourselves. So it's just a warning that favoritism can and does do untold damage. But let's move on to verse 4. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. They loathed the presence of their brother. He had these two dreams, Joseph, and I'm not going to go into detail. Most of us know them. And the interesting thing is that everyone knew what they meant, didn't they? Joseph understood it, Jacob understood it, the brothers very much understood it. And in verse 8 there we read that they hated him the more. And then, of course, he tells the second dream. And in verse 11, we hear his brothers were jealous of him. Jealousy was really at the heart, wasn't it, of Cain's murder of Abel. And I wonder whether jealousy was really at the heart of the sin of Adam and Eve. One of the things the serpent did very cleverly was to say, but if you ate of that fruit, you'd be like God, because then you'd know and have the knowledge of good and evil. Jealousy, wanting something we don't have. The serpent sort of saying to Adam and Eve, God's withheld something from you. Don't you want that also? So jealousy was right at the heart. So what happens next? Let's have a look at a quick map we should have up here. There we go. I don't know how well you can see that, but they were in the area Hebron down there in the south, and the brothers head up through Bethel, up that red line, up to Shechem, and then on to Dothan. And not surprisingly, Jacob wants to know how they're getting on. So he sends Joseph. And they can see Joseph coming on the horizon. Perhaps they can tell the figure of his body, his outline. But then perhaps as he got closer, there he was wearing that wretched tunic. Their blood was beginning to boil. And I want you to try and picture this scene, as it were. And they're infuriated by his dreams. And as they're there, and then one of them voices the unthinkable. I remember watching a film, it was a good film actually, on Joseph. And I think they got this scene right, and one of them just said, "I say we kill him." And the others sort of looked shocked, surprised. And another one says, "But we can't, he's our brother." And one says, "Yeah, but I'm fed up with those dreams." And then, of course, Reuben intervenes and has this secret plan and says, let's put him in a cistern. Then we can say that a wild animal has killed him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams, they say, don't they, in verse 20. So this chain of reaction, can you see sin getting its grip tighter and tighter and tighter? The plot is hatched. And then we're really at verse 23. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe. And the original word there has an idea of really a frenzied assault, like soldiers might assault someone, might be on the rampage. They wanted to get rid of Joseph. They wanted to get rid of this symbol that stood for their hatred, his supposed dominion over them. And they have this cistern nearby. That would be an ideal plan, they thought. And then, do you know, in verse 25, having thrown him down into the cistern, what do we read? It's striking, isn't it? Again, you can just read it. And they sat down to eat their meal. That's what sin does. Our hearts can get so cold. How could they do that? And as they were sitting there eating this food, which, by the way, was quite possibly from supplies brought by Joseph from the family in Hebron, they would have heard his cries for help at the bottom of the cistern, the pit. Then they see some businessmen. And if we just go back to that map again, it gives us an idea. This is really the you can't see it very well on there, but that sort of blue dotted line there coming across from your left down through here, down here to Egypt. That was a well-known route for the spice traders as they were going to go and take their goods down to Egypt to sell them. This time it's Judah's time to pipe up, and he comes up with plan B. Let's sell Joseph, then we won't be guilty of his blood. And in verse 28, the deal is done. The 20 shekels of silver are handed over. Then, of course, Reuben returns, and he's shocked not to see Joseph there in the bottom of the cistern. And then again, sin just takes a grip of all of their hearts, and they come up with this plan with the animal and drenching the robe in the blood and so on, a plan to deceive their father Jacob. Really, this plan is as callous as the plan to put Joseph in the pit. How could they watch as we read on in the chapter, as Jacob is so distraught and he mourns, and a number of commentators say here that he mourned much longer than the normal period of time. He goes as far to say, doesn't he, I will mourn till I go to the grave, till the end of my life. How could they look their father in the face? Any hope that Jacob might redirect some of his love or attention from Joseph to them was soon gone. So we've looked through that first window. We've seen the scene, as it were, through the eyes of Joseph's brothers. What do we see? Unwise words, sinful actions, selfishness, pride, hatred, jealousy, sin and its effects everywhere, strained and broken family relationships. And the strange thing is, isn't it, that as we start to sort of apply this to ourselves, we can be so quick to see the sins of others, but so slow to see our own sins, or even blind to see our own sins. I'm sure you've probably heard of, as far as I know, a true story. In the early 1900s, the Times posed a question to a number of well-known authors at the time, and the question was this: what is wrong with the world? And as Fred said, and I'm sure we often do, we watch our TV screens and we watch the news, and that question is uppermost in our mind. And even non-Christians sometimes just say, what is wrong? Well, you can imagine they had many different replies, but one man by the name of G.K. Chesterton wrote into the Times, and he said this: "Dear Sir, I am yours, G.K. Chesterton." And my question this morning is this, friends: have we seen that? I know many of us have. But have we seen that? Or do we need to see it afresh? That the problem with this world is me and you. We need a rescuer. There is a rescuer. Have we confessed? Have we cried out to the Lord for help? A couple of weeks ago, we were in the Lemon Tree. Hadn't been there for quite a while. They do a very good steak and ale pie, by the way, if you like that. The meat was so tender. I don't know how they got it like that. And Grandma's not here this morning, so I can say this, although I'll get in trouble later anyway. But Grandmas like spending long times in cafes, don't they? You sort of, 2.5 hours, and it's still not time to go. So Kitty Rose fishes out her notebook and says, "Dad, let's do a game of hangman." "Okay," I say. And Grandma joins in as well. Do you know the word she chose for hangman? Onomatopoeia. You know they've grown up, don't you? Well, I don't know about the hardest word to spell, but I know what the hardest word is to say. Sorry. Have you said that to God? I am sorry. What a mess this chapter is. And maybe, as we look in this chapter and we see hatred and we see jealousy and we see envy and we see selfishness, and there's that in our families, isn't there? We need a rescuer. There is a rescuer. Window number 2. And these are shorter, by the way, the next 2 windows, so don't panic. Window number 2 is Joseph. Dave asked me again this morning, we were talking in the kitchen, and I don't know actually the real answer to this. In the beginning stages, what was Joseph really thinking? And how full of himself was he? I don't know whether we actually know completely. But as I said, that report he gave of his brothers, and I trust those who have a far greater understanding of Hebrew than I do, it was a bad report. He did make it sound worse, and maybe that gives us some clue. But anyway, let's follow it through, trying to, as much as we can, be in the shoes of Joseph. So Jacob is concerned about his brothers. They're in Shechem. You could understand why, because of previous events that we looked at last week. And it's interesting, it's about 50 miles to Shechem, so probably, say, 5 days' travel maybe, and then another 13 or 14 miles to Dothan. But as Jacob comes to Joseph, Joseph just agrees, he's obedient, and he goes on this journey at some danger to himself. What did he expect? What kind of reception do you think he was expecting from his brothers? Well, he gets there anyway, to fast forward. I wonder as he got there whether he sensed something about their body language. Or maybe he began to hear the anger in their voices. He felt that firm grip as they grabbed his body and they started to rip off his robe. As they started to drag him towards the cistern, he felt his feet being dragged across the ground. And as he saw in the short distance ahead a cistern, he began to dawn on him, surely they're not going to, are they? His heart was pounding, his body was shaking. He was pleading with his brothers. Don't do this, don't do this. Push, shove, thud. He's down in the cistern. Some of these were 6 meters deep. He was bruised. Maybe he was cut. Maybe there was blood running down parts of his face. And he heard them shout from the top, "Now what's come of your dreams?" He feels around at the bottom of the cistern. It's dry. It's cold. It's semi-dark. It's horrible. And then he thinks, well, okay, I've learnt my lesson. They've taught me the lesson. He shouts up, "No more evil reports, no more dreams." But it kind of just echoes around this cistern. It was a bottle-shaped kind of design that was used to store water. Surely he was expecting them to pull him out, wasn't he? Is this really happening? How could they do this to me? No water in the bottom. Very little clothing on. It still gets very cold, doesn't it, in the desert at night time? Basically, if he was left there, he would die. No water, no food, no protection from the cold, and no way to climb out. Do you think that Joseph quietly sat at the bottom of the cistern and said, "No problem, God's got it sorted"? I don't think so. In actual fact, we know not so. I don't want to fast forward too much, but I'll just say that we know that he cried out because his brothers confessed that later on. Picture it there. Perhaps he called to the oldest first, "Reuben, Reuben, you can't leave me here. Judah, Simeon, Levi, help me. Don't leave me to die." What was going through Joseph's heart and mind? Why, God? Why? My dreams told me I was the favorite one. Now I'm in the bottom of a smelly, dark pit. But before too long, he hears their voices again. They're getting me out. They've come to their senses. Oh, what a relief. God's rescuing me. Then he sees the traders. Then he sees the money handed over. Then he's tied and he's shackled. Then the sheer thought of horror fills his heart. I'm not being rescued. I'm being sold as a slave. And as the caravan restarts, he glances back. And one of the traders laughs at him. Oh, there's no point looking back. You won't see them again. We're off to Egypt and you're going to make us a tidy profit. Look ahead. Walk on. Condemned to be a slave. Do you know the average age of a slave in the time of Pharaoh was 30 years? So he's got 13 years of hard toil and then he'll die. He was a human. He was just like you and me. Perhaps there's a time in your life when you've hardly known how to pray, but if you're honest, your heart just is, why? Where is Joseph's God now? Where is my God now? Isn't God supposed to work everything out for good? Isn't God supposed to be our shepherd and our protector and our provider? Haven't I sought to follow him and obey him and live for him? Remember, Joseph had been obedient. He'd followed his father's command. He'd gone to Shechem. He'd gone to Dothan. He'd found his brothers. Why has he allowed this to happen? And if you're asking that question this morning in your life, don't feel guilty. Someone once said, I don't think we should ask questions of God. And I just thought, the Psalms? I want to read a verse which I think is very, very significant. You don't need to turn to it, but it's in Acts chapter 7. Stephen is giving an address, and he comes to verse 9 where he says this. Because the patriarchs were jealous of Joseph, they sold him as a slave into Egypt. But God was with him and rescued him from all his troubles. Joseph probably didn't see it at that moment, but God was with him. God is with us in the deepest and toughest things. I think we have a picture. Any ideas what it is? No. The blue is over the picture. The picture is the white bit round it. So I've given you a bit of the picture. Any ideas? Not very good, are you? No. Go on then, Marcus. There we are. You were never going to guess what that was because you saw just a small part of the picture. I think there's a lesson there, isn't there? And I chose a goldfish as well because apparently goldfish have 3 or 4 second memories or whatever it is. But more so because, let's say we've got this goldfish, Gertie, I don't know, whatever you want to call him. Do you think Gertie knew this week that President Trump was inaugurated? Nope. Do you think he knew? Did you think that goldfish was concerned or knew that there was going to be a bad storm that was going to come across Northern Ireland and Scotland? Nope. In fact, he doesn't know much, does he, Gertie? And neither did Jacob, and neither did Joseph, and neither did his brothers. They were oblivious to what was going on largely. And little did his brothers know that in their very actions, they were fulfilling Joseph's dreams. You see, God's ways are so much higher and so much bigger and so much beyond us. And we see just such a little tiny, tiny bit. And yet sometimes when I see that little tiny, tiny bit, if I'm honest, I'm saying to God, you've messed up, God. You've got it wrong, God. Why aren't you doing something, God? In his grace, he understands that I only see that little bit of the picture. I had a friend, I grew up with him. He was a bit older than me, but we did youth camps together. He sort of was a bit of a mentor, really, with a number of people on youth camps. And in God's mysterious plan, he was taken at the age of 47 from cancer. He was a pastor in London. And in the dying months of his life, he took his church through Job. I'd imagine that they were awesome sermons. And I've got 11 points here, and that makes everyone panic, doesn't it? But I'm just going to read them out. I'm not going to comment on them. I'm aware that time is not on my side. But just maybe someone needs to hear one of these this morning. And while it's on Job, I think it equally applies to Joseph's life. This is what this man wrote. God is always good and always fair. 2, God only has blessing for his people. 3, God works the most negative and painful things for the good of his people. 4, there is so much we cannot understand because we are not God. 5, we don't need to understand everything. We do need to trust God in everything. 6, knowing God is more important than knowing why. God has many reasons for suffering and many purposes, and everyone is good. The devil tries to use our suffering to turn us away from God. God uses our suffering to turn us to God. Our suffering may not be because of our sin, but it is easy to sin in our suffering. Comforting others in suffering requires as much grace as suffering ourselves. And finally, our suffering is temporary. If we trust in the ultimate sufferer, God has provided a solution to suffering. Suffering will give way to glory. Okay, I've messed up on time as I normally do. Window 3, which we will look through very, very, very quickly, is God's perspective. God isn't mentioned in chapter 37. So is he absent? Is he a spectator? No. He's the main player on the stage, as always. The dreams, remember, particularly in that culture at that time, were a message from God. Not one of the strange dreams that we have that sometimes are just odd and don't really mean anything. The fact that he had 2 dreams also was a way of God confirming this was a message from God. What would have happened if Joseph had not had those dreams? Then we have this coincidence. I love this man who turns up out of the middle of nowhere. Who was he? What was he doing there? He just happened to hear that they were going to Dothan. Moses records, and it's significant, there was no water in the cistern. If it had been half full or completely full, Joseph would have eventually drowned. Oh, well, these traders happened to turn up. Coincidence after coincidence. If you want something to talk about over your Sunday lunch, does God believe in coincidences? Does God believe in coincidences? And finally, of course, he's sold To whom of all people? Into a slave in the house of Pharaoh. Every stage and detail being worked out by God. Window number 3, let's sum it up like this. We can rest in God. We need a rescuer. We need faith, not answers. And we can rest in God. As it's been rightly put, we can sleep because God doesn't. Earlier back in Genesis, and I think it's striking, Abraham says at one point, "Will not the God of all the earth do right?" That's resting in God, isn't it? And I find that incredible because Abraham did not have the whole of the Bible, and he didn't have all of the books that have been written and the whole of the internet and all the resources that we have and God's full revelation. If Abraham could say that, can't we? We should be able to, shouldn't we? God will do right. I want to leave us, for 2 reasons, where the chapter leaves us. I want to give you that hint. I want to give you that glimmer of hope. Yes, there is a rescuer coming. In fact, there are many rescuers coming. And all of those rescuers point to the rescuer. And that's to come in the rest of Genesis and beyond. But where does this chapter leave us? Well, it leaves us with Jacob utterly distraught. His son has been devoured by an animal as far as he knows. He'll never see him again. His brothers, surely, however hardened their hearts had got, must have been guilt-laden as they looked on and saw their father in such distress. Joseph is 1,000,000 miles away as a slave, likely to never see his family again. What had happened to those dreams? He wasn't a ruler. He was the very opposite, wasn't it? He was a slave. And the second reason why I want to leave us there is, firstly, because the narrator does, but sometimes that's where we are in life, isn't it? God hasn't shown us the answer yet. We're not delivered yet. We're still at the bottom of the pit. We're still in slavery. We're still perplexed at God's working out in our lives. Where is God in our ever so tangled and messed up lives? Where is he? Well, my answer to that is this. He's where he's always been and where he always will be. 1, he's on the throne, and that means he's in complete control. And the second answer is he's with his people, just like he was with Joseph. And I don't know what you're facing in your life at the moment, but maybe there's something in the life of Joseph that connects with you and relates to you and your family and your situation. God is on the throne, and he cares, and he loves. I think sometimes, I don't know, maybe it's just me, but do you sometimes cry out, people don't understand? And they don't, because they haven't been through what you've been through. They might try to, but they don't understand. But he does. God does understand.